When Victor Sterling lifted the plate of food to scrape it into the trash that Tuesday morning, he had no idea he was seconds away from discovering something that would save his life and shatter his marriage of nearly 3 decades. The firm grip of the cook who caught his arm in that instant would reveal not only the cure for a mysterious illness that no doctor could diagnose, but also a dark secret his own wife had been hiding for years. Something so calculated and cruel, it would forever change everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him. What began as a simple gesture to prevent wasted food would transform into a journey of devastating betrayals, emotional upheavals, and a profound transformation that would prove sometimes we need to lose everything to finally discover what truly matters. Stay until the end to find out how a humble cook unraveled not only the symptoms of a rare syndrome, but also a web of lies that had been putting a successful businessman's life at risk for much longer than anyone imagined. That Tuesday morning arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, with that thick, suffocating humidity typical of a southern summer, the kind that clings to the skin and makes every movement feel heavy. In the kitchen of the Sterling residence, Elena Rios watched the leaves of the old oak tree sway slightly outside the window while carefully stirring the contents of a seasoned cast-iron pot. At 48, she had learned that some gestures couldn't be rushed, that certain things required time and attention to reveal their true value. The aroma rising from the stove was different from the usual. A combination of herbs and spices she had been preparing for days, adjusting proportions, testing flavors, all with a very specific purpose in mind. Elena wiped her hands on the embroidered apron she had worn since starting work at the house 4 months ago and looked at the wall clock. Victor Sterling was 15 minutes away from coming down for breakfast, and she knew this would be a decisive moment, perhaps the most important since she had first walked through the gate of this estate. Victor Sterling was 52 and carried on his shoulders the weight of commanding a regional logistics and packaging solutions firm that employed 120 people. His face, marked by worry lines and sleepless nights, told the story of someone who had built everything himself, who had come from nothing and erected an empire he was immensely proud of. But over the last 2 months, something had changed. The man who used to wake up at 5 a.m. to review reports before breakfast now descended the stairs with difficulty, dragging his feet, one hand always braced against the wall as if he needed that support to keep from collapsing. The abdominal pains started as an occasional nuisance, something he ignored with the characteristic stubbornness of someone who always believed willpower was enough to overcome any obstacle. Then came the extreme fatigue, that feeling that every cell in his body weighed a ton, and the strange sensitivity to foods he had consumed without issue before. Elena had noticed everything. Since the first day, when Caroline Sterling had hired her through a referral from a cousin living in Atlanta, she had observed. It wasn't the casual, superficial kind of observation, but something deep and methodical that came from years of caring for someone whose life depended on her attention to detail. Her mother, who had passed 3 years prior, had suffered for 15 years with a rare condition of severe food intolerance, and Elena had learned firsthand what doctors sometimes took years to diagnose. Every reaction Victor had after meals, every mumbled complaint about discomfort, every time he pushed away a barely touched plate, it all formed a pattern in her mind, a puzzle she quietly assembled while she worked. That morning, when Victor came down the stairs with the same exhausted air that had become his trademark, Eleanor had already arranged the plate she had prepared with such care on the table. It wasn't the usual breakfast full of gourmet bagels, imported cheeses, processed meats, and high-fructose orange juice that Caroline always insisted on buying. It was something completely different, a meal she had planned with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, based on techniques she had learned years ago from a holistic nutritionist in the Pacific Northwest. when she was still desperately seeking ways to alleviate her mother's suffering. Victor looked at the plate with an expression that mixed confusion and irritation. His natural arrogance, that posture of someone who believed only academic knowledge held real value, shone through every line of his face. He picked up the plate with a brusque movement, ready to dump everything into the trash, when he felt a firm hand grip his arm. Elena was standing there beside him, and her brown eyes held a determination he had never noticed before. "Please, Mr. Sterling." Her voice was low but firm. "Just try it. I prepared this specifically with your symptoms in mind. I know you've consulted several doctors and that no test has shown anything conclusive, but sometimes the answer is in places conventional medicine takes too long to look." The businessman hesitated. There was something in Eleanor's gaze that made him pause, a conviction that went beyond the simple insistence of an employee trying to please her boss. He thought of the 5 specialists he had consulted in the last few months, the dozens of tests he had undergone, the vague diagnoses, and the treatments that led nowhere. He thought of the mornings he could barely get out of bed, the important meetings he had cancelled, the contracts he had failed to close because he didn't have the energy to sustain even a half-hour conversation. With a sigh of resignation mixed with desperation, Victor sat down at the table and, following Elena's whispered instructions, began to eat slowly, paying attention to every flavor, every texture, every sensation the food provoked. What happened in the following hours was something Victor couldn't explain with his usual corporate logic. For the first time in months, the abdominal pains didn't come. The fatigue that usually enveloped him like a heavy cloud seemed less oppressive. He managed to work in his home office for 3 straight hours without needing to lie down, without feeling that exhaustion that turned simple thoughts into Herculean tasks. When Elena served lunch, another carefully planned meal different from anything he usually ate, Victor didn't protest. He ate in silence, watching the cook with a new curiosity, as if he were seeing her for the first time despite her working in his house for 4 months. In the days that followed, Elena prepared increasingly elaborate meals, gradually eliminating ingredients she suspected were the culprits. She kept an old notebook tucked into her apron pocket where she meticulously recorded everything. Victor's reactions, the times symptoms appeared or disappeared, and the food combinations that worked best. It was a painstaking, almost scientific effort in its precision, but based on a wisdom that came from lived experience rather than academic textbooks. Victor, naturally skeptical but desperate for relief, agreed to follow her guidance. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he couldn't deny the results. After 3 weeks on Elena's specialized diet, the businessman was able to return to working normally at the firm, something he hadn't done for nearly 2 months. It was at this point that Caroline began to exhibit behavior Elena found strange. Victor's wife, with her 50 well-preserved years and the air of superiority she always wore like a shield, started appearing in the kitchen several times a day, questioning the ingredients of the meals with an insistence that went beyond simple curiosity. "You need to go back to real doctors," she would tell her husband whenever she had the chance. "These strange concoctions aren't proper treatment for anything." But Victor, for the first time in 28 years of marriage, ignored his wife's persistence. He felt good, better than he had in months, and that was all that mattered right now. What no one knew, what Caroline hid behind her forced smiles and veiled criticisms of Elena, was that her husband's recovery represented a direct threat to her plans. Over the past 8 months, while Victor languished in his mysterious illness, Caroline had begun siphoning money from the company to cover mounting gambling debts. High-stakes, underground poker clubs in Savannah had become her refuge, the place where she tried to fill a void she couldn't even name herself. It started with small bets, then grew larger, and before she knew it, she owed amounts that made her stomach churn. Victor's illness had been convenient. He was too preoccupied with his own problems to pay attention to the finances, to notice the strange transfers, the unexplained withdrawals. But now, with him regaining energy and mental clarity, it was only a matter of time before he discovered everything. Elena sensed the growing tension in the house. There was something in the glances Caroline shot her way, in the way she spoke on the phone, in a low voice, and quickly hung up when someone entered the room, and in the envelopes that arrived in the mail that Caroline hid before her husband saw them. The cook didn't fully understand the situation, but her instinct, the same one that had guided her to save Victor, told her there were problems beyond the visible ones. She continued her work, preparing the meals with the same care, noting everything in her journal, creating a routine that was restoring health and life to the businessman who, weeks prior, seemed on the verge of total collapse. It was on a Friday, nearly a month after that decisive first morning, that Marissa Sterling arrived at her parents' house unannounced. Victor's 26-year-old daughter worked as the operations manager at her father's firm, a position she had earned not just through family ties, but through genuine competence and dedication to the job. Marissa had inherited her father's determination and, unfortunately, some of his arrogance. When she saw her father apparently recovered, when she heard him talk about the special diet Elena prepared, when she noticed the almost reverent gratitude with which he spoke of the cook, something inside her bristled. It made no sense that a simple household employee could succeed where 5 specialized physicians had failed. Marissa's suspicion grew, fueled by the subtle comments Caroline planted whenever she had the chance. "She's manipulating your father," her mother would whisper, preying on his vulnerability. "You need to do something before it's too late." And Marissa, with all her Ivy League education and her unwavering belief in traditional scientific method, began to believe that there was something wrong, something suspicious about the whole situation. She couldn't accept that knowledge could come from unconventional sources, that lived experience could be as valuable as degrees hanging on the wall. To her, Elena was just an unschooled cook who was somehow conning her father in a moment of weakness. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon when the family was gathered for lunch. Marissa waited until her father stepped out to take a call and then entered the kitchen where Elena was finishing up dessert. The words that came out of her mouth were harsh, accusatory, filled with a rage that stemmed from both genuine concern and wounded pride. "You are taking advantage of my father's condition," Marissa said, her voice controlled but laced with venom. "Making him dependent on you, manipulating him with these strange recipes. I don't know what you're trying to gain, but this ends now." Eleanor felt every word like a slap. She, who had dedicated months of silent work, who had poured all her knowledge and care into helping Victor, who had asked for nothing in return beyond her modest salary, was now being accused of the worst intentions. Her hands trembled as she held the wooden spoon she used to stir the dessert. For a moment, she considered simply accepting the accusations in silence, gathering her things and leaving a house where she was clearly not welcome. But then she thought of her mother, of all the years she had fought to keep her alive and comfortable, and all the specialized knowledge she had acquired through that struggle. She thought of Victor, how clearly better he was, and how abandoning him now would be wasting all the progress they had achieved. With a dignity that surprised even herself, Elena replied that she had something to show and asked Marissa to wait. She went up to the small apartment above the garage where she lived, a simple space with a bed, a wardrobe, and an old desk she had found in the basement and restored. From the desk drawer she pulled out the notebook where she had been recording everything about Victor's reactions, a detailed log she had started weeks before, preparing that first special meal. She returned to the kitchen and placed the open journal on the table in front of Marissa. Pages upon pages of careful observations, timings, symptoms, correlations between foods and reactions, all noted in neat handwriting and a methodology that, while not following formal medical protocols, demonstrated a profound understanding of what was happening to Victor. "I am not manipulating anyone," Elena said, her voice steady. "I am helping your father the only way I know how. With the knowledge I gained, caring for someone I loved who suffered from something similar." Marissa looked at the notes with an expression that wavered between skepticism and surprise. What she saw was not the work of someone trying to deceive, but of someone who genuinely cared and who had dedicated considerable time and effort to understanding and solving a problem. But her pride was still too wounded to admit she might be wrong. She snapped the journal shut and left the kitchen without another word, leaving Eleanor alone with a pounding heart and a feeling of powerlessness that made her want to weep. In that moment, the cook realized that saving Victor physically might be the easiest part of the journey that had begun that Tuesday morning. There were forces working against her, interests and egos she didn't fully understand, but sensed were dangerous in a way she couldn't articulate. The days following the confrontation with Marissa were marked by a tension that permeated every corner of the Sterling residence. Elena continued her work with the same dedication, preparing the special meals that kept Victor healthy. But now there was an added weight on her shoulders, a constant feeling of being watched and judged. Caroline intensified her appearances in the kitchen, and her questions ceased to be subtle, turning into disguised interrogations. "Where did you learn these recipes? Who taught you? Do you have a degree, any formal training?" The questions were loaded with suspicion, and Elena responded with the patience she had cultivated over years of dealing with difficult situations. But internally, she felt the growing exhaustion of constantly having to justify her worth and intentions. Victor, oblivious to the tensions simmering in his own house, continued his work routine with an energy he hadn't experienced in months. The logistics firm demanded his full attention, and he plunged into business with the renewed enthusiasm of someone who had been given a second chance. There were major contracts to negotiate, suppliers to manage, and employees depending on his decisions. But even immersed in work, Victor didn't fail to notice how different he felt, how much clearer his mind was, how his body responded in ways it hadn't in a long time. And somewhere deep in his consciousness, he knew he owed it all to the woman who worked silently in his kitchen, preparing every meal as if it were a carefully calculated medical prescription. It was during this period that Caroline began spreading rumors among the firm's staff. She knew several of the administrative assistants and executive aides through social events she had hosted over the years, and she used these connections with calculated cunning. Seemingly innocent comments about how Victor was dependent on a cook who used dubious methods, insinuations that Elena might have interests beyond honest work, veiled suggestions that something wasn't right about the whole situation. The rumors spread like wildfire, gaining details and distortions with every repetition, until they reached Marissa's ears in ways that further convinced her that her initial suspicion was correct. Elena felt people's gazes shift when she went to the local farmers' market in downtown Charleston to buy the fresh ingredients she needed. The vendors who used to chat amicably now seemed reserved. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes, and she heard whispers that abruptly stopped when she passed. The cook didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew something had changed in how she was perceived, as if a shadow had been cast over her reputation without her doing anything to deserve it. Still, she continued her work, because she believed the truth would eventually reveal itself, that results would speak louder than rumors and suspicions. The second month after that first decisive meal brought unexpected changes. Victor, feeling completely recovered, decided he wanted to better understand what Elena was doing. It was no longer enough simply to follow her directions. His business side, his need to comprehend and control, demanded explanations. One morning, before leaving for the firm, he asked Elena to sit with him in the living room and explain exactly what was happening, what the principles behind the diet were, and how she knew what would work. The cook, feeling uncomfortable in the luxurious room where she had never sat before, began to tell her story, speaking about her mother, about the 15 years of intensive care, about the holistic practitioner who had guided her when conventional medicine had no more answers to offer. As Elena spoke, Victor listened with an attention he rarely dedicated to anything unrelated to business. There was something in the way she described her mother's suffering, the hopelessness she had felt, the small victories won through trial and error that touched a part of him that had remained dormant for decades. He recognized that despair, that feeling of being adrift while specialists offered only empty words and ineffective treatments. When Eleanor finished her story, Victor remained silent for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. For the first time since she started working in his house, he truly saw her as a person, with her own history, with losses and triumphs, and not just as someone fulfilling a function. But this emerging connection between employer and employee did not go unnoticed by Caroline. The wife watched every interaction between them with increasingly sharp eyes, interpreting simple conversations as something sinister, seeing threats where there was only nascent respect and gratitude. Her gambling debts continued to grow, and the creditors from the underground poker clubs in Savannah were starting to lose patience. Threatening phone calls came at odd hours, men with gruff voices saying she had 2 weeks to pay what she owed or the consequences would be severe. Caroline knew she couldn't raise that money without Victor finding out, but she also knew she couldn't simply confess. Fear gnawed at her from within, transforming her into someone increasingly desperate and unpredictable. It was in this context of escalating tension that the first genuinely serious incident occurred. Victor began to feel some of the symptoms that had plagued him months ago. Abdominal pains that appeared without warning, a fatigue that made no sense considering how strictly he had been eating. Elena was alarmed and confused, mentally reviewing everything she had prepared, trying to understand what could have changed. It was only when she was putting away the groceries from the market that she noticed something odd. Some of the specialty ingredients she had purchased days earlier were different, replaced by versions that looked similar, but were not exactly the same. Someone had tampered with her pantry, swapping the specific products she used for generic ones, silently sabotaging the work she had been doing. The discovery left Elena in shock. Who would do such a thing? And why? She thought of Caroline, her constant visits to the kitchen, her incessant questions, but she couldn't imagine anyone being capable of deliberately harming her own husband's health. Still, from that moment on, Eleanor began to lock the pantry whenever she left, keeping the key with her, and started verifying every ingredient before use. Victor's symptoms improved again as soon as she regained full control over what he consumed, but the businessman was shaken by the relapse. His confidence, both in his own body and in the stability of his recovery, suffered a significant blow. Marissa, observing the situation from her vantage point at the firm, decided she needed to take more drastic measures. She couldn't simply allow an uncredentialed cook to continue treating her father as if she were a healthcare professional. Using her contacts and her position, she scheduled an appointment with a renowned gastroenterologist specializing in complex GI disorders at the Duke University Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina. Her intention was to take her father for a complete evaluation, obtain a formal diagnosis, and finally prove that Eleanor was either just lucky or worse, doing something that could be dangerous in the long run. She communicated her decision during a family dinner, announcing that she had already booked everything and that her father was going, whether he liked it or not. Victor, surprised by his daughter's assertiveness, agreed to go, but with one condition. He wanted to take Elena's detailed log. He wanted the doctor to analyze the work she had been doing. Marissa tried to argue that this was unnecessary, that a layperson's notes would hold no value for a specialist, but Victor was firm. "If we're having this consultation, it's happening my way," he said, with the authority of someone unaccustomed to being contradicted. Elena, upon learning of the plan, felt a mixture of hope and terror. Part of her wanted a professional to validate her work, to confirm she wasn't doing anything harmful, but another part feared that everything she had built would be dismissed as irrelevant by someone who only trusted formal tests and protocols. The week leading up to the appointment was one of the hardest Elena had faced since starting work at the Sterling House. Caroline intensified her attacks, spreading more rumors, making increasingly acidic comments about the cook whenever she had the chance. The firm's employees who once greeted Elena now avoided her, and she felt the weight of silent judgment wherever she went. At night, in her simple apartment above the garage, she reread the pages of her journal, doubting herself for the first time in a long while, questioning whether she truly knew what she was doing or if she was just a woman too arrogant to recognize her own limitations. The day of the consultation arrived with an overcast sky threatening rain. Victor and Marissa left early for Durham, taking Elena's notebook and all the previous inconclusive test results. The cook stayed at the house, trying to keep busy with chores, but unable to stop thinking about what was happening in that medical office miles away. Caroline was also home, and Elena could feel her eyes following every move, as if waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow, to finally expel the intruder who threatened her desperate plans to keep her secrets and mounting debts hidden. When Victor returned late that afternoon, his face was serious, indecipherable. Marissa trailed behind him, her expression a mix of shock and something that looked like profound embarrassment. They entered the house in silence, and Elena felt her heart race, bracing for the worst. Victor asked her to sit down and, in a controlled voice heavy with emotion, began to explain what the gastroenterologist had said. The doctor had spent 2 hours analyzing Elena's meticulous notes, cross-referencing them with the previous tests and new ones performed during the consultation. His diagnosis was clear and devastating in its simplicity. Victor suffered from a rare malabsorption syndrome, a condition the previous doctors had overlooked because they focused only on conventional testing and failed to pay enough attention to the patient's specific dietary patterns and reactions. The gastroenterologist was impressed by Elena's work, recognizing in those notes a methodology that, while not following formal medical protocols, demonstrated a deep intuitive understanding of what was happening. He explained that the type of diet Elena had created was precisely the recommended treatment for the condition, and that she had arrived at this conclusion through careful observation and practical experience. More strikingly, the doctor had noticed the sabotage, the ingredient substitutions that had caused Victor's temporary relapse, and warned that someone in the household was deliberately trying to undermine the treatment. The revelation hit everyone like a bombshell, and Victor's eyes turned slowly toward Caroline, who had visibly paled as she listened to her husband's account. Marissa was clearly shaken, her certainties crumbling before the irrefutable evidence that she had misjudged the situation from the start. She looked at Elena with eyes that pleaded for apologies her voice couldn't yet form, too ashamed to admit aloud how wrong she had been. Caroline, for her part, tried to deny any involvement, her voice rising in a defensive pitch, accusing everyone of conspiring against her, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The tension in the room was palpable, a moment suspended in time where long-hidden truths began to emerge from the shadows, threatening to shatter the fragile structures that held that family together. It was then that Victor, with a chilling calm more frightening than shouts, said they needed to have a serious conversation about many things, not just his health, but everything that had been happening in that house over the past months. He looked at Caroline with an intensity that made her hands tremble, and for the first time in 28 years of marriage, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a cold determination to uncover the entire truth, no matter how painful it might be. Elena, sensing her role at that moment was merely to observe, discreetly moved to leave the room, but Victor stopped her with a gesture. "Stay," he said. "You have a right to hear this too, you who saved my life while others," he paused, looking directly at Caroline, seemed to have other interests in mind. Night fell over Charleston, with a fine rain drumming against the windows of the Sterling residence, creating a background soundtrack for the tense silence that dominated the living room. Victor sat in his leather armchair, the same one where he used to review financial reports on Sundays, but this time the papers spread before him were not from the firm. They were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, documents he had begun reviewing after the consultation at Duke, driven by a disturbing intuition he couldn't ignore. Caroline stood on the other side of the room, her hands clasped in her lap, her face carefully composed in an expression of offended innocence that convinced no one anymore. Marissa remained standing near the doorway, as if a part of her wanted to flee the scene, but her sense of responsibility kept her trapped. Elena sat in a chair near the kitchen entrance, present, but trying to make herself invisible, an involuntary witness to a family collapse that was escalating. Victor began to speak in a controlled voice that barely disguised the rage simmering beneath the surface. "Over the past 8 months," he explained, flipping through the documents, "there have been substantial transfers from the joint account I maintain with Caroline, withdrawals at strange hours, payments to people and establishments I don't recognize. When he was sick, barely able to think straight, these movements went unnoticed. But now, with a clear mind, thanks to Elena's work, he had decided to investigate. What he found was devastating, a money trail that led directly to the underground poker clubs in Savannah, accumulated debts reaching amounts that made even a successful businessman swallow hard. Caroline tried to interrupt, beginning to offer explanations that sounded like rehearsed excuses, but Victor raised his hand for silence. "I'm not finished yet," he said, and there was something in his tone that made even Elena shudder. The businessman continued, revealing that he had hired an independent forensic accountant to audit the financial movements, and what he discovered went beyond what he had imagined. Caroline had not only used money from the couple's personal account, but had also accessed the firm's operating funds, using her position as the owner's wife to authorize small withdrawals that, summed up over the months, represented a significant hole in the working capital. The logistics firm, which employed 120 families in Charleston, was being jeopardized to feed a destructive addiction Caroline had masterfully concealed. Marissa let out a sound of disbelief, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide as she realized the extent of what her mother had done. "How could you?" she whispered, not directed at anyone in particular, just verbalizing the shock they all felt. Caroline finally broke down. Tears came, accompanied by broken confessions about how it all started innocently, a few small bets to fill the emptiness she felt, the loneliness of being married to a man consumed by work, the invisibility of being merely the successful businessman's wife without an identity of her own. But the excuses sounded hollow, given the magnitude of her actions, and Victor listened with an expression that mixed pain and disbelief. When she finished speaking, he revealed the most painful part of his discoveries. Among the belongings Caroline kept in her private closet, he had found old medical records, prescriptions from a gastroenterologist she had consulted more than a year ago, long before Victor began showing visible symptoms. The prescriptions indicated specific tests for malabsorption syndromes, suggesting that Caroline knew, or at least suspected, what her husband was suffering from long before he sought medical help. The revelation landed like a sentence. Caroline had hidden crucial information about her own husband's health, keeping him ignorant of a diagnosis that could have been made much earlier had she shared those suspicions. The motive was obvious. A sick and confused Victor was convenient, less likely to question financial movements, more dependent on her in ways that kept her secrets safe. The sabotage of the ingredients in the pantry was not accidental. It was a desperate attempt to keep her husband debilitated when Elena's intervention started working too well. Marissa backed up until she leaned against the wall, her mind struggling to process the idea that her mother had not only hidden a destructive addiction, but had actively jeopardized her father's health to protect her own interests. The image she had of her family, already shaken, disintegrated completely in that moment. Elena watched everything in silence, tears streaming down her face without her making an effort to contain them. They were not tears of vengeance or satisfaction at having been proven correct in her work, but tears of deep sorrow at witnessing the suffering of that family. She thought of her own mother, of how she had fought to keep her alive and comfortable until the last day, of how true love meant sacrifice, not sabotage. The cruelty of what Caroline had done was almost incomprehensible to someone like Elena, whose entire life had been defined by genuine care for those she loved. Yet watching Caroline collapse in those confessions, Elena recognized a woman broken by her own demons, someone who had made terrible choices but was now facing the brutal consequences. Victor announced that he wanted an immediate separation. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of reconciliation in the face of such layered betrayal. He gave Caroline 1 week to arrange a place to live and remove her belongings from the house, and after that he never wanted to see her again. As for the gambling debts, he would pay them, not for her sake, but to protect the family name and prevent dangerous individuals from continuing to make threats that could put everyone at risk. But every cent would be documented as Caroline's personal debt, to be deducted from any asset division in the divorce proceedings. The decision was pronounced with a coldness that left no room for argument, and Caroline, realizing she had lost everything, simply nodded amidst her tears, defeated and small, in a way no one in that room had ever seen her. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and practical changes. Caroline spent most of her time locked in her room, only emerging to take care of the necessary arrangements for her move. Marissa took responsibility for helping her mother with the logistical aspects, although the relationship between them was irrevocably damaged. The daughter couldn't look at Caroline without feeling a mixture of pity and anger, remembering how she had been used as an instrument to discredit Elena, how her own insecurities and prejudices had been manipulated to serve her mother's selfish purposes. Every interaction was heavy with unspoken words, with hurts that would take years, perhaps decades, to begin to heal. During this transition period, Victor isolated himself in his work with an intensity that worried even the most dedicated employees at the firm. He arrived before everyone and left after, reviewing contracts, reorganizing finances, compensating for the shortfalls Caroline had caused. But work was just a way to avoid thinking, to avoid feeling the pain of a betrayal that went far beyond the stolen money. 28 years of marriage, memories he thought were real. A foundation he discovered was built on lies and convenience. In the evenings, when he finally returned home, Victor would sit at the kitchen table where Elena prepared his meals. And sometimes they would talk about simple things, the weather, the ingredients she used, how his day had been. They were mundane conversations, but in them, the businessman found a comfort he couldn't find anywhere else. Elena perceived Victor's suffering in ways he himself didn't verbalize. She saw it in the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking, in the way he pushed the food around his plate when his mind was too far away to register the taste. In the moments he simply paused mid-action, lost in thoughts that clearly tormented him. The cook adjusted her recipes, preparing dishes that not only tended to his physical health, but offered emotional comfort. Combinations her own mother used to make when she needed solace. They were small gestures of care that Victor noticed and appreciated, though he rarely found adequate words to express his gratitude. It was during the 5th night after the revelation that Victor had a serious relapse of his symptoms. The emotional stress, combined with sleepless nights and constant tension, triggered abdominal pains so intense he could barely breathe. Elena found him hunched over the kitchen sink at 3 in the morning, sweating cold and trembling, clearly in agony. Without hesitation, she prepared a specific tea she had learned to make for her mother during acute crises, a combination of herbs with soothing and anti-inflammatory properties. While waiting for the water to boil, she spoke to Victor in a low voice, gentle words about breathing, about letting the pain pass, about how the body sometimes reacted to emotional suffering in physical ways. Her serene presence, her firm but gentle voice, helped Victor navigate the crisis without needing to wake Marissa or seek emergency medical help. When the pain finally subsided and Victor could breathe normally again, he looked at Elena with tears in his eyes. They were not just tears of physical pain, but of gratitude, of relief, of a vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "You saved my life," he said, his voice husky. "Not just with the food, but you truly saved my life." And Elena, sitting beside him in the quiet kitchen, illuminated only by the faint light over the stove, simply held his hand and said that was what she was there for, that caring for people was what gave meaning to her own existence after losing the one she had loved most. In that moment, in the middle of the night, in the kitchen, a connection formed between them that went beyond employer and employee, a mutual understanding between two human beings who had faced their own forms of loss and suffering. On the day Carolyn finally left the house, there were no dramatic goodbyes or emotional scenes. She simply placed her bags in the car Marissa was driving, cast one last look at the house that had been hers for nearly 3 decades, and drove away. Victor watched from his home office window without descending to say goodbye, maintaining the distance he needed to keep from collapsing. Elena continued her work in the kitchen, preparing lunch as she did every day, but her hands worked automatically while her mind pondered fates and choices, about how entire lives could crumble because of decisions made in moments of weakness and desperation. She felt no satisfaction in seeing Caroline leave, only a deep sadness for everything that had been destroyed and could never be rebuilt in the same way. In the weeks following Caroline's departure, the house took on a new dynamic. Marissa began visiting more frequently, arriving early some mornings to have coffee with her father before work. Their conversations were cautious at first, as if both were relearning how to interact without Caroline mediating or manipulating their exchanges. Slowly, father and daughter began to reconstruct a relationship based on honesty, sharing concerns about the firm, about the future, about how to deal with the wounds the revelation of maternal betrayal had left on both of them. Marissa also made a point of seeking out Elena privately, offering formal apologies for her accusations, for her distrust, for letting prejudice and manipulation cloud her judgment. The apology was sincere, weighted with genuine shame, and Elena accepted it with the grace of someone who understood that everyone made mistakes when guided by fear and insecurity. But despite the improvements in the family dynamic, Victor continued to struggle emotionally. There were days he managed to function almost normally, focusing on work and his responsibilities, but there were others when the weight of the betrayal crushed him in ways no diet or medicine could alleviate. He discovered that his arrogance, his unwavering belief in his own ability to control everything, had been not just wounded, but fundamentally questioned. If he couldn't perceive what was happening in his own home, with his own wife, what else was he failing to see? Who else was suffering around him while he remained blind in his bubble of corporate certainties? The questions haunted him, turning his physical recovery into something paradoxically more difficult than when he was sick and oblivious to so much. It was Elena who first realized that Victor needed more than just physical care to fully recover. She saw how he pushed the food around his plate even when it was something he usually enjoyed, how his eyes drifted away during meals, how he sometimes simply stopped eating mid-bite and stared into space. One evening, after a particularly silent dinner, she sat across the table from him and said something she had been pondering for days. "Mr. Sterling," she said gently, "the body needs nutrition, but the soul does too, and sometimes the pain in the soul affects the body in ways no food can cure. Perhaps it's time to care, not just for what you eat, but for what you feel." The words were simple, direct, but carried a wisdom that came from someone who had gone through her own processes of grief and healing. Victor considered Eleanor's advice with more seriousness than he would have given similar suggestions from other sources. There was something in the way she knew him, how she understood his patterns and reactions, that gave her unique credibility. In the days that followed, he began to allow himself to feel the pain instead of just burying it in work. He cried alone in his room, shouted his frustration at the walls, allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways he had avoided his entire adult life. And Elena was always there, not invading his space or forcing conversations, but present in a way that communicated without words that he was not alone in his suffering. It was a difficult period, perhaps the hardest Victor had ever faced, because for the first time he was confronting not only external problems, but his own internal flaws. His pride, his willful blindness, his emotional neglect of those closest to him. It was in this moment of renewed fragility that something happened that would fundamentally change the course of Victor's recovery. He was in his home office late at night, reviewing divorce documents with a half-empty bottle of expensive bourbon beside him, when Elena tapped softly on the door. She carried a tray with hot soup and fresh bread, but her purpose went beyond simply feeding him. "Mr. Sterling," she said firmly when she saw the bourbon bottle, "you know that will make you sick, that it will trigger the symptoms again, and it would be a shame to waste all the progress we've achieved so far." There was kindness in her words, but also an authority that surprised Victor. For the first time in his life, someone was setting boundaries with him, not out of fear or personal gain, but out of genuine care. And this realization hit him in a way none of the previous revelations had managed, finally opening space for a real transformation he didn't even know he needed. The following morning brought unexpected clarity to Victor. He had slept better than he had in weeks, and upon waking he found a note from Elena beside his bed, saying that breakfast was ready when he came down, no rush, in his own time. The small gesture of consideration, so simple yet so rare in his life, stirred something deep in his chest. When he finally descended, he found in the kitchen not only the carefully prepared meal, but also Marissa sitting at the table, having coffee. His daughter had arrived early, specifically to talk to him, and her expression was serious but not hostile. "We need to talk about the firm," she said, as Victor sat down, "and about how you've been overworking yourself trying to fix everything alone. I've noticed the reports you review late at night, the decisions you're making without consulting anyone, and I'm worried you're repeating the same patterns that made you sick before." Victor automatically started to defend himself, to argue that he was only doing what was necessary to restore the company's financial stability after Caroline's shortfalls. But he stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Marissa, truly saw her for the first time in a long while, and realized she was right. He was indeed falling into the same old patterns, taking all the weight on himself, trusting no one, operating as if only he could solve the problems. It was the same behavior that had emotionally distanced him from his family, that had created the void into which Caroline had lost herself, that had nearly killed him before Elena intervened. The realization was like a punch to the gut, painful but necessary. "You're right," he admitted in a low voice, something he rarely did. "I'm doing everything wrong again." Marissa reached for her father's hand across the table, a gesture of connection they hadn't shared since she was a child, and proposed that they start working together for real, not just as father and daughter or as owner and manager, but as partners who respected and trusted each other. Elena watched the scene from the kitchen as she brewed more coffee, and her heart warmed, seeing father and daughter beginning to rebuild a relationship that the crisis had both damaged and, paradoxically, made possible. She thought of her own family, of the years she had spent caring for her mother alone because there was no one else, of how different it would have been if she had had someone to share that burden. The loneliness she had felt in those years had shaped who she was, making her independent but also profoundly isolated in her responsibilities. Seeing Victor and Marissa learning to lean on each other was a reminder that not everyone had to carry their burdens alone, that there were other ways to be strong that didn't involve isolation and absolute self-reliance. In the following weeks, the dynamic at the firm visibly began to change. Victor delegated more responsibilities to Marissa and other trusted managers, involving them in key decisions instead of simply imposing his will. Employees noticed the difference, commenting during breaks on how the boss seemed more approachable, less intimidating, more willing to listen to suggestions. The rumors Caroline had spread about Elena were gradually replaced by a different narrative, the true story of how a dedicated cook had saved the businessman's life when conventional medicine had failed. Some people remained skeptical, but most began to view Elena with respect, especially after Victor publicly acknowledged her role during a meeting with all the firm's employees. But not everything was improving. Victor continued to struggle with waves of sadness that came without warning, moments when the reality of being alone after almost 3 decades of marriage hit him with renewed force. There were nights he walked through the empty house, passing rooms that were once filled with Caroline's presence, however problematic that presence had proven to be. The loneliness was different from the kind he felt when he was sick. It was more existential, a feeling of being adrift without the familiar anchors that, even if illusory, had given structure to his life. Elena noticed these moments, seeing when he stood looking out the window for too long, when his expression became distant during meals. She didn't try to fill that void with empty words or forced optimism, but simply remained present, a silent constant that communicated he wasn't completely alone. It was during this period of adjustment that Elena received 3 different job offers. The first came from a wealthy family in Raleigh who had heard about her work through the gastroenterologist at Duke, offering a salary nearly 3 times what she received from the Sterlings. The second was from a restaurant specializing in clean eating in Atlanta, wanting to hire her as a menu consultant. The third came from an acquaintance from her time caring for her mother, a woman who now ran an integrative nutrition clinic and wanted Elena as part of her team. They were tempting opportunities, each offering not only more money but also professional recognition in ways she had never experienced. Elena considered each offer carefully, noting pros and cons in her worn journal, but always returned to the same conclusion. It wasn't time to leave yet. There was something unfinished in her mission with Victor, a sense that her work there went beyond merely healing him physically. When Victor learned of the offers through Marissa, whom Elena had mentioned them to casually during a conversation, he was deeply shaken. The possibility of losing Elena, of having to face his continued recovery without the person who best understood his needs, triggered a panic that surprised him with its intensity. He realized he had become dependent on her in ways that went far beyond nutrition, that she had become an essential presence in his life without him noticing when or how it had happened. The night after discovering the offers, Victor had another crisis of symptoms, but this time it wasn't just emotional stress. It was the real fear of abandonment, the feeling that he was about to lose yet another important person in his life. Elena found him, as always, prepared what was necessary to alleviate the symptoms. But this time, Victor couldn't hide his desperation. "Please don't leave," he said, his voice broken. "I know I have no right to ask this. I know you deserve those opportunities, but I need you here." The words came out unfiltered, raw in their vulnerability, and Victor realized too late how selfish they sounded. Elena was silent for a long moment, her hands busy preparing the tea that always calmed him, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not going anywhere yet, but I need you to understand that I can't stay forever just because you've become accustomed to my presence. I need you to learn to take care of yourself, to make healthy choices even when I'm not here to guide you. My job is not to make you dependent on me, but to teach you to be independent again, only this time in a way that honors your health and well-being." Marissa watched the impromptu cooking lessons with a mixture of surprise and delight. Seeing her father, always so rigid and formal, making jokes about burning the rice or cutting vegetables unevenly, was simultaneously strange and wonderful. She began to participate too, creating family moments that hadn't existed before, conversations that flowed naturally as hands worked together preparing food. Elena became not just a cook or a nurse of sorts, but a teacher, sharing knowledge she had held for years and now found pleasure in transmitting. There was something profoundly satisfying in seeing Victor and Marissa learn, in knowing that even after she left, they would have the necessary tools to continue caring for themselves. It was in that same week that something no one expected happened. Caroline appeared at the front door without warning, in the middle of a rainy afternoon, asking to speak with Victor. Marissa, who was visiting her father, answered the door and froze upon seeing her mother there, visibly thinner, with deep circles under her eyes and a fragility that wasn't present when she left months ago. She came to ask for forgiveness, not to return or to recover what she had lost, but to try and find some form of peace with herself. Victor initially refused to see her, but Elena, who overheard the conversation from the kitchen, gently suggested that perhaps it was important for both of them to have that conversation, that some wounds needed to be confronted to truly heal. Against all his instincts, Victor agreed to give Caroline 15 minutes of his time. The conversation took place in the living room, with Marissa present as a silent witness. Caroline spoke about the months she had spent alone, about how she had sought help for her gambling addiction, about the therapy she had started, about how she was finally confronting the demons that had led her to destroy her own family. She didn't ask for forgiveness expecting to receive it, but simply because she needed to verbalize her regret, to acknowledge aloud the magnitude of what she had done. Victor listened to everything with an impassive expression without interrupting her, and when she finished, he said something that surprised even himself. "I appreciate you coming and saying that, but I can't forgive you now. Perhaps I never can. What you did was deliberate and cruel, and it permanently changed who I am and how I see the world. But I hope you find a way to forgive yourself and build something better with what remains of your life." Caroline accepted the answer with tears in her eyes, nodded silently, and stood up to leave. Before leaving, she looked at Marissa and whispered an apology that her daughter wasn't ready to accept, but which registered somewhere deep as something she might one day revisit. After Caroline drove away, the house was silent for a long time. Victor remained seated in the armchair where he had been during the conversation, processing everything he had heard, feeling contradictory emotions he couldn't completely name. Elena brought tea without being asked, placing the steaming cup on the table beside him, and her calm presence was what finally allowed Victor to take a deep breath and begin to release the tension that had accumulated during that unexpected meeting. That night, For the first time since everything began, Victor managed to speak openly about how he felt regarding the end of his marriage. Not just the anger over the betrayal or the sadness over the loss, but also the relief of being free from a relationship that, he now realized, had been dysfunctional for much longer than he was willing to admit. He spoke about how he and Caroline had emotionally drifted apart years ago, how they built parallel lives under the same roof, how convenience and the fear of change kept them together long past the point where they should have recognized they no longer functioned as a couple. Elena and Marissa listened, occasionally offering perspectives, but mostly just being present, creating a safe space for Victor to process decades of repressed emotions that were finally finding a voice. The fifth month brought significant changes at the firm. With the finances finally stabilized and Caroline's shortfalls completely compensated, Victor and Marissa began implementing changes that had been discussed but never executed. They created an employee holistic wellness program that included access to nutritional guidance, directly inspired by the work Elena had done with Victor. It's not charity, Victor made sure to emphasize, but an investment in people, recognizing that healthy, valued employees were more productive and loyal. The idea stemmed from late-night kitchen conversations, where Elena had casually mentioned how many health issues could be prevented or improved with adequate attention to nutrition, and Victor had transformed that observation into a concrete business initiative. Elena was invited to help structure the program, working with credentialed nutritionists to create guidelines that were accessible and practical for people with different needs and budgets. It was the first time her knowledge was formally recognized and valued in a professional context, and the experience was both gratifying and intimidating. She found herself in meetings with people who held multiple university degrees, contributing perspectives based on lived experience that they respected and incorporated into their plans. It was a validation unlike anything she had ever experienced, proving that wisdom could come from many sources and that her personal journey caring for her mother had value that went far beyond her individual situation. But amidst all these positive changes, Victor faced a new challenge. He discovered that as his physical health fully stabilized and his emotional life began to reorganize, he needed to confront who he wanted to be moving forward. The version of himself that existed before he got sick, that arrogant, emotionally closed-off businessman, was no longer who he wanted to be. But building a new identity at 52, after decades of operating in a certain way, was frightening and disconcerting. There were moments when he simply didn't know how to act, how to balance his natural authority with the vulnerability he now recognized as strength, not weakness. It was like learning to walk again, every step uncertain but necessary, and there was no map or guide for this kind of profound personal transformation. It was Elena who offered the perspective Victor needed. "You don't need to become a completely different person overnight," she said during one of those late-night conversations that had become routine. "You just need to be a little more honest with yourself and with others every day, letting people see that you are also human, that you also make mistakes and doubt and need help sometimes. That doesn't diminish you, it just makes you more real. And real people build real connections, while masks only attract other masks." The words were simple, but they carried a truth that resonated deeply with Victor. He had spent decades wearing professional and personal masks, projecting an image of absolute control that had isolated him from genuine connections. Now, stripped of those masks by the crisis he had endured, he had the opportunity to build something more authentic. And despite the fear it caused, he also felt an excitement he hadn't experienced since his youth, when everything still seemed possible and he hadn't yet hardened himself against the world. The 6th month since that decisive morning brought with it the start of autumn in Charleston, with temperatures beginning to drop and the trees on the Sterling property taking on golden hues. Victor was in his home office at the firm when he received an unexpected call from the gastroenterologist at Duke. The doctor wanted to schedule a follow-up consultation to assess the progress of the treatment, and his voice on the phone carried a professional curiosity that went beyond standard clinical interest. When Victor arrived at the specialist's office the following week, bringing with him new test results and Elena's updated logbook, the doctor spent over an hour meticulously reviewing everything. The results were remarkable. The malabsorption syndrome was completely controlled, inflammatory markers had normalized, and even more impressively, Victor had managed to maintain the necessary discipline to follow the treatment without significant deviations, even during the emotionally turbulent period of the divorce. The gastroenterologist made an unexpected proposal. He was writing an article for a major medical journal about cases of malabsorption syndromes that had been diagnosed through unconventional methods, and he wanted to include Victor's story, obviously maintaining his anonymity. More than that, he wanted to interview Elena, document her methodology, and understand how she had arrived at the conclusions that led to the correct diagnosis when multiple specialists had failed. The idea was controversial, he admitted. Many of his colleagues would be skeptical about giving credit to someone without formal medical training. But he believed there was value in recognizing that knowledge could come from diverse sources and that traditional medicine sometimes benefited from listening to unconventional perspectives. Victor was surprised by the proposal, but also felt a protective pride toward Elena, a desire for her work to be recognized and validated in ways she herself had never sought. When Victor shared the proposal with Elena, her reaction was complex. Part of her felt honored that her work was considered worthy of medical documentation, but another part felt uncomfortable with the idea of exposure, even if anonymous. She hadn't done what she did seeking recognition or external validation. She had simply used the knowledge she possessed to help someone in need. The attention felt almost like a betrayal of the purity of her intentions. But Marissa, when she learned of the proposal, offered a different perspective. Think of how many other people could benefit if doctors started paying more attention to dietary patterns and caregiver observations, she argued. How many people are suffering right now with conditions that could be alleviated if there was more openness to different types of knowledge? You could make a difference for people you'll never meet, and isn't that what you've always wanted? To help people? Elena considered Marissa's words for several days, weighing her personal reservations against the potential broader benefit. Finally, she agreed to participate, but with conditions. She didn't want her observations presented as if she were competing with traditional medicine, or as if she knew more than trained doctors. She only wanted it to be acknowledged that long-term caregivers develop an expertise that deserves consideration, especially when conventional methods were not providing answers. The gastroenterologist readily accepted her conditions, and they scheduled a series of interviews where Elena explained in detail her methodology, the principles she learned caring for her mother, and how careful observation over time could reveal patterns that point-in-time tests sometimes missed. The process was revealing for both her and the doctor, creating a dialogue between two worlds that rarely communicated productively. Meanwhile, at the firm, the changes implemented by Victor and Marissa began to show tangible results. The wellness program had been received enthusiastically by employees, many of whom had never had access to proper nutritional guidance. Stories began to circulate about people feeling better, having more energy, better managing chronic conditions that had plagued them for years. Productivity increased, but more importantly, the work environment became visibly more positive. Employees who once saw Victor as a distant, intimidating figure began to see him as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. The businessman's transformation didn't go unnoticed, and although some of the older managers initially resisted the changes, considering them overly sentimental for a corporate setting, the results were hard to argue against. It was during this period of growth and positive change that Victor received news that shook the foundations he had been rebuilding. One of his main regional competitors had made an offer to buy his firm, a generous sum that would allow him to retire comfortably and never have to worry about spreadsheets and contracts again. The offer came through intermediaries, presented as a unique opportunity that shouldn't be wasted. Victor was 52, had gone through personal and professional hell in recent months, and the idea of simply selling everything and starting over held a seductive appeal. He could travel. He could finally rest. He could do all the things he had always postponed in the name of building and maintaining his business empire. But the decision wasn't as simple as it seemed. The firm wasn't just a business to Victor. It was his legacy, the result of decades of hard work, tangible evidence that he had built something significant from nothing. More importantly, there were 120 families who depended on that firm for their livelihood. Employees who had worked for him for years, some for decades. Selling to a competitor meant having no control over what would happen to these people, whether the new owners would maintain the programs he and Marissa had implemented, whether they would treat the employees with the respect he now recognized as essential. The night after receiving the offer, Victor couldn't sleep, his mind spinning between practical arguments and ethical considerations he wouldn't have cared about months ago before his forced transformation. Elena immediately noticed Victor's restlessness. She found him at 3 a.m, sitting in the kitchen, looking at papers spread on the table, a cup of cold tea beside him. Without saying anything, she brewed fresh tea and sat in the chair opposite, waiting. Eventually Victor began to speak, pouring out all his worries and doubts, the temptation to simply give up and live a simpler life versus the sense of responsibility he felt toward the people who depended on him. Elena listened without interrupting, and when he finally finished, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. "My mother used to say that the hardest decisions are the ones where both options have merit," she said softly, "because it means you have to decide not based on what is easiest, but on what is truest to who you want to be. If you sell, you will have peace and comfort, but you will have to live knowing you left behind people and principles you now value. If you stay, you will have work and stress, but you will also have purpose and the chance to continue building something that goes beyond profit." Elena's words crystallized something Victor had been trying to articulate in his own mind. He had spent months learning that being vulnerable was not a weakness, that human connections mattered more than absolute control, that caring for others was a form of strength. Selling the firm now would be denying all those lessons. It would be reverting to the old Victor who placed personal convenience above all else. The next morning, he called the intermediaries and declined the offer, a decision that left him feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. But when he shared his decision with Marissa, he saw in his daughter's eyes a pride he hadn't seen since she was a child, and he knew he had made the right choice, even if it was the most difficult one. The refusal of the offer triggered a series of unexpected events. The competitor, who had tried to buy the firm, frustrated by the rejection, launched an aggressive campaign to steal Victor's clients, offering predatory prices that were clearly unsustainable in the long run but caused immediate damage. Important contracts were lost, profit margins tightened, and for the first time since his recovery, Victor felt real financial pressure that threatened not only his own livelihood, but that of all his employees. Meetings at the firm became tense, with managers pushing for drastic measures like layoffs to cut costs. But Victor resisted, remembering that he had rejected the sale offer specifically to protect those people. It was easy to be ethical when everything was going well, but now he was being truly tested, having to choose between principles and pragmatism under real duress. Marissa stood by her father throughout the crisis, working long hours to find creative solutions that allowed the company to remain competitive without sacrificing employees. They renegotiated with suppliers, explored new markets, optimized processes, doing everything they could to keep the firm viable. It was during this period of struggle that Victor realized something fundamental. He wasn't facing this alone. He had Marissa by his side. He had a team of managers who, despite the pressures, remained dedicated because they saw that he genuinely cared about them. He even received suggestions from production line employees who, feeling finally valued and heard through the programs that had been implemented, offered practical ideas for improving efficiency. The company he had built was no longer just his personal creation. It had become something larger, a collective effort that reflected not only his vision, but the contributions of dozens of people. And through it all, there was Elena. She didn't understand business or corporate strategy, but she understood caring for people under pressure, maintaining sanity when everything seemed to be falling apart. She continued preparing Victor's meals with the same care, adjusting combinations to give him energy when he was exhausted, calm him when he was too anxious, ensuring that stress didn't trigger a relapse in the symptoms that had taken so much work to control. Their late-night conversations in the kitchen became the time when Victor could completely drop his guard, admit his fears and doubts without feeling judged or diminished. Elena had become more than a cook or even a friend. She was an anchor that kept him connected to himself when external pressures threatened to transform him back into the closed-off, arrogant man he used to be. The 7th month brought an unexpected turn in the corporate battle. One of the largest clients Victor had lost to the competitor returned, explaining that the products received were of inferior quality despite the lower price, and that they valued the long-term relationship and reliability the Sterling firm had always demonstrated. It was a small victory, but a significant one, proving that quality and integrity still mattered in the market. Other clients began returning as well, having similar experiences, and gradually the financial situation began to stabilize. The competitor, finding that its predatory pricing strategy wasn't working as expected, eventually backed off, and the storm that had threatened to destroy everything Victor had built began to pass. But the crisis left its mark. Victor was exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical, an existential fatigue that made even breathing seem laborious. He had proven to himself that he could maintain his principles under pressure, but the cost of that proof was high. One evening, sitting in the kitchen with Eleanor after a particularly difficult day, he admitted something he had been avoiding acknowledging. "I don't know if I have the energy to keep doing this for much longer," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Not the company, but this improved version of myself that everyone now expects. It's exhausting trying to be good when it would be so much easier to go back to how I was before, distant and focused only on results." Eleanor looked at him with an understanding that came from facing her own moments of moral exhaustion during the years caring for her mother. Being the best version of yourself is not something you achieve and then maintain effortlessly, she said. It's a choice you make every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And some days you will fail, you will revert to old patterns, and that is human. The important thing is to wake up the next day and choose again, to keep choosing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The words resonated with Victor deeply. He had been thinking of his transformation as a journey with a final destination, when in fact it was a continuous process, a daily effort that never truly ended. The realization was simultaneously discouraging and liberating. Discouraging because it meant he could never simply relax and assume he was cured of his old way of being. But liberating because it meant occasional failures didn't erase all the progress he had made. He was human, imperfect, And learning to accept that imperfection while continuing to strive for improvement was perhaps the most important lesson of all, more important even than learning to eat correctly or manage his firm ethically. It was in this context of exhaustion, but also renewed acceptance, that something happened that would change everything. Elena received a call from Atlanta, a family emergency that required her immediate presence. A distant cousin, who had been kind to her during the years caring for her mother, was gravely ill, and Elena was the only person this cousin could call. She needed to leave immediately and didn't know how long she would be gone. Perhaps days, perhaps weeks. The news left Victor panicked, not just because he depended on Elena's special meals to maintain his health, but because he had grown accustomed to her presence, to the late-night conversations, to the feeling of not being completely alone in his large, empty house. But he swallowed his panic and told Elena to go, that he would be fine, that everything she had taught him over the past months had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. Elena left that same afternoon, leaving detailed instructions on recipes and preparations, emergency numbers if Victor needed nutritional guidance, and a promise that she would return as soon as possible. In the first few days after her departure, Victor tried to maintain the routine they had established, preparing his own meals, following her recipes, but he found it harder than he expected. Not because the recipes were complicated, but because cooking for himself, eating alone at the large kitchen table without Elena's tranquil presence, made the solitude of his current life impossible to ignore. He had built a structure of recovery that depended too much on a single person, and now that person was absent, the cracks in that structure became painfully obvious, forcing him to confront truths about himself and his emotional needs that he had been avoiding for a long time. Elena's absence stretched into 2 weeks that felt like months to Victor. He maintained discipline with the meals, meticulously following the instructions she had left, but found that the food tasted different when prepared by his own hands in an empty kitchen. Marissa visited more frequently, noticing her father's fragile emotional state, and often stayed for dinner, bringing a presence that slightly eased the loneliness, but didn't eliminate it completely. It was during one of these visits that Marissa made an observation Victor had been avoiding confronting. "Dad, you're in love with her, aren't you?" The question came out of nowhere, direct and blunt, and Victor froze, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a denial that sounded convincing. But the words didn't come, because the moment Marissa verbalized what he had been trying not to recognize, the truth became undeniable. Victor was 52 and had just emerged from a marriage of nearly 3 decades that ended in betrayal and destruction. The idea of allowing himself to feel something romantic for someone, especially for a woman who worked in his house, who had saved his life in ways he could never truly repay, seemed simultaneously absurd and terrifying. There were so many reasons why those feelings were inappropriate. The difference in social and economic positions, the gratitude that could easily be mistaken for love, the fear of ruining a relationship that had become essential to his emotional survival. But while all these rationalizations circled in his mind, Victor couldn't deny how he felt when Elena was present. The way his entire day seemed lighter when he heard her voice in the kitchen. How simple conversations about ingredients and recipes became the moments he most looked forward to. How the house felt like an empty tomb without her there. Marissa watched her father process this revelation with an expression that mixed understanding and concern. She wasn't judging. She had seen how Elena had cared for Victor, not just physically but emotionally. How she had been present during the worst moments without ever asking for anything in return. But she also knew that expressing these feelings could complicate everything, could put Elena in an impossible position, could destroy the dynamic that had been so crucial to her father's recovery. "And what are you going to do about those feelings?" Marissa asked gently. Victor shook his head, sincerely not knowing the answer. "Probably nothing," he replied after a long silence. It wouldn't be fair to her, not after everything she's already done for me without expecting anything beyond her salary. And besides, he paused, his voice dropping lower. Why would she feel anything like that for me? I'm just another job to her, another person who needed help. The following days were a torture of self-doubt for Victor. He revisited every conversation he'd had with Elena, searching for signs that might indicate she felt something beyond professional concern. But everything he found could be interpreted as simply her being good at her job, dedicated and thoughtful in the way she was with everything she did. He thought of all the reasons why keeping those feelings to himself was the most sensible decision, but he also thought of how his entire life had been defined by sensible decisions that left him isolated and unhappy. Caroline had been a sensible choice, an appropriate wife from a respectable family, and look where that had led. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, in his most desperate moments of hope, sensibility was overrated, and the courage to pursue genuine connections was what truly mattered. When Eleanor finally returned to Charleston, it was almost 9 on a Friday evening. She was visibly exhausted. 2 weeks caring for her sick cousin had taken its toll. But even so, she went directly to the Sterling residence instead of going to her own apartment first. She found Victor in the kitchen trying to prepare dinner, and the scene was simultaneously touching and comical. Unevenly chopped vegetables scattered across the counter, pots of food in various states of preparation, and Victor himself in a stained apron with an expression of frustrated determination. Seeing her at the door, his face lit up in a way that made Eleanor's heart clench. She had missed him too, she realized with surprise. Missed the late-night conversations, the satisfaction of seeing him improve, the way he had transformed from a distant employer into someone she genuinely cared about, though she wasn't ready to examine too closely the exact nature of that care. Elena took control of the kitchen with her usual efficiency, saving what could be salvaged from Victor's culinary experiments and improvising with the rest. As she worked, Victor sat at the table and began recounting the 2 weeks, how the firm was doing, the small victories and ongoing challenges, but mostly about how much he had missed her presence, the conversations that made everything more bearable. Elena listened as she cooked, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the work. There was something in the tone of Victor's voice, in the way he spoke about her absence, that suggested feelings she didn't know how to interpret or how to respond to. When she finally placed the plates on the table and sat across from him, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken things, a tension neither of them knew how to break. It was Victor who finally found the courage, perhaps because 2 weeks of solitude had weakened his usual defenses, or perhaps because he was finally learning that vulnerability was sometimes necessary. "Elena," he began, his voice uncertain in a way she had never heard before, "I need to tell you something, and you might find it inappropriate, or it might ruin everything between us, but I can't keep it inside anymore. The last 2 weeks made me realize that what I feel for you goes far beyond gratitude for saving my life or respect for your work. He paused, trying to find the right words. I care about you in ways I haven't allowed myself to feel for anyone in a long time, maybe ever, truly. And I know this complicates everything. I know you might not feel the same, and if that's the case, we can pretend I never had this conversation and continue as we were." Elena remained completely still, her fork suspended in the air between the plate and her mouth, processing what she had just heard. Part of her had expected something like this. She had noticed over the past months how Victor's gaze had changed, how he found excuses to prolong conversations, how his gratitude seemed to have layers that went beyond the professional. But hearing it spoken aloud, having to confront those feelings concretely, was different from simply suspecting. She thought about her life, how she had dedicated 15 years to caring for her mother, how after the loss she had simply continued caring for other people because it was what she knew how to do, never stopping to consider what she herself wanted or needed. She thought about Victor, how he had transformed from an arrogant, closed-off man into someone vulnerable and genuine, how she had witnessed and facilitated that transformation, how she had felt seeing him grow and change. "Mr. Sterling," she began, and he immediately interrupted her. "Please don't call me that, not now, just Victor." Eleanor nodded, starting again. "Victor, I don't know what to say because I've also been feeling things I didn't expect to feel, but I'm afraid these feelings might be confusing for both of us. You've been through so much trauma recently, and I've been part of your recovery, and how do we know what we feel is real and not just—" She searched for the right words. "Not just gratitude on your part and professional satisfaction on mine. How do we know we're not confusing intimacy of care with something more?" The questions were valid, and Victor didn't have easy answers for them. But he knew one thing. In the moments when she wasn't caring for him, when they were simply talking about mundane things or sitting in comfortable silence, he felt something he recognized as genuine, a connection that went beyond circumstances or roles. They talked for hours that night, exploring their feelings with an honesty that was terrifying yet liberating. Elena spoke about her own insecurities, about how she had defined herself for so long through caring for others that she didn't know who she was outside that role, about how the thought of being with Victor romantically brought up issues of power and ownership that deeply unsettled her. Victor listened to everything, acknowledging the validity of every concern, but also arguing that they were two adults who had been through transformative experiences and deserved the chance to explore what might exist between them without letting fear or social conventions dictate their choices. "I'm not asking for an answer now," he said, as the first light of dawn began to clear the sky. "I'm just asking you to consider the possibility, not to automatically dismiss what could be something real and meaningful." Eleanor agreed to think about everything they had discussed, and in the following days, the Sterling house operated in a strange suspension of tense normality. They maintained their routines, she preparing meals and he working at the firm, but there was a new awareness in every interaction, an attention to chosen words and gestures that were once natural, but now seemed loaded with additional meaning. Marissa noticed the change immediately when she visited, and after watching her father and the cook carefully dance around each other, she decided to intervene. She invited Elena for coffee at a neutral location, away from the house and the complications it represented, and there, sitting in a modest cafe in downtown Charleston, she had a frank conversation with the woman who had saved her father in more ways than just physically. Marissa explained that she wasn't there to give permission or approval, but to share her perspective as a daughter who had witnessed her father's transformation. "He is a different man now," she said, "and you are a fundamental part of that change. But more than that, you connect in a way I've never seen my father connect with anyone, not even my mother on their best days. I know there are complications. I know people will judge. They'll say you took advantage of the situation, or that he's confusing gratitude with love. But I've seen you both together, seen what you are to each other when you think no one is watching. And I think you both deserve the chance to find out if this is real, without letting fear or others' opinions stop you." Marissa's words touched Elena deeply, not because they gave her permission she didn't need, but because they validated that what she felt wasn't just her imagination, that there were external witnesses to the connection she and Victor shared. That same evening, Eleanor made her decision. She found Victor in his home office, surrounded by papers as always, and asked to speak. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her own ears, but her voice came out firm when she began to speak. "I've spent the last few days thinking about everything you said about us, and I've reached a few conclusions. First, you were right about one thing. What I feel for you goes beyond the professional, and trying to deny that would be dishonest with myself." But she raised her hand when she saw his face light up. I also know that entering any kind of relationship while I am still technically your employee would be problematic in ways neither of us can simply ignore. So, if you want to explore what could exist between us, I first need to no longer work for you. Not because I don't like the job or because I want to leave you unsupported, but because we need to be on equal footing without the power dynamic that comes from you being my employer. Elena's proposal took Victor completely by surprise. He hadn't considered that she would resign. He had assumed they would find a way to navigate the situation while maintaining the status quo. But she was right, obviously. As long as she worked for him, there would always be a shadow over any relationship they tried to build, always questions about genuine consent and free choice. But the idea of not having her in the house every day, of losing the kitchen conversations, and the tranquil presence that had become essential to his routine was almost unbearable. "What if my symptoms return?" he asked, and heard how desperate and selfish he sounded even before finishing the sentence. Elena smiled with a tenderness that made his chest clench. "You will be fine," she said with conviction, "because I spent months teaching you to take care of yourself, because Marissa learned too and can help you when you need it, and because I'm just a phone call away if you truly need guidance. But you have to do this. You have to prove to yourself that you can maintain your health independently of me, or we will never be sure if what we feel for each other is real or just dependence dressed up as something else." Victor knew she was right. He recognized the wisdom in that demand, even as every part of him wanted to protest and find a solution that didn't involve change. But wasn't that exactly the lesson he had been learning for months? That growth required discomfort, that real transformation meant leaving behind what was familiar and safe. He agreed to Elena's conditions, and the following week she officially resigned. The news caused waves of speculation among the firm's employees who still followed the situation. But Victor and Elena kept their reasons private, simply stating that she had decided to pursue other opportunities and that they parted on good terms. Marissa, who knew the truth, helped her father hire a new cook, a competent middle-aged woman who followed the nutritional guidelines Elena had established but lacked the same transformative presence. The next 2 months were a period of painful adjustment. Victor and Elena met occasionally for coffee or dinner, always in public places, carefully navigating the initial stages of something that was no longer professional but still not fully defined as romantic. They talked as they always did, but there was a new lightness, a freedom that came from no longer having the barrier of employer and employee between them. Victor discovered layers of Elena he had never seen before. Her dreams that went beyond caring for other people, her passions for literature and music that she rarely had time to explore, her perspective on the world that was both pragmatic and profoundly hopeful. And Elena discovered that Victor, outside the context of his house and his illness, was unexpectedly funny, had strong opinions on topics she never expected to interest him, and possessed an emotional vulnerability he never would have allowed her to see when he was her boss. Slowly, cautiously, they built something new. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt where both questioned whether they were making a mistake, whether they were confusing familiarity with romantic compatibility. There were also the inevitable reactions from other people, judging looks when they were seen together, whispered comments about opportunism and convenience that hurt Elena especially, who had always prided herself on her integrity. But Victor defended her in a way that demonstrated how much he had changed, directly confronting those who made insinuations, making it clear that Elena had not only saved his life, but remained one of the most integral people he knew, and that any relationship between them was based on mutual respect and genuine connection, not convenience or material gain. It was during this period that the last and greatest twist occurred. Victor was organizing old documents in his home office when he found, hidden deep in a drawer he rarely opened, an envelope he didn't remember storing there. Inside were old medical documents, very old, from before he started showing visible symptoms of his condition. The prescriptions and notes were from a doctor Caroline had consulted not once, but several times over the years. And reading the notes, Victor discovered something that chilled his blood. Caroline hadn't just known about his potential condition for over a year. She had known for nearly 5 years. There was evidence that she had taken him to consultations where the doctor suspected the malabsorption syndrome and recommended specific tests, but she had actively sabotaged those investigations, scheduling appointments and then cancelling, losing test results, doing everything she could to keep him in the dark about his own health. The revelation was devastating in ways Victor didn't expect he could still feel regarding Caroline. He thought he had already confronted the full extent of her betrayal, but this was different. This was evidence of a calculated cruelty that spanned years, not months. She had deliberately kept him sick, allowing his condition to worsen when early intervention could have prevented much of the suffering he had experienced. And why? To keep him confused and dependent while she siphoned money, but also, the notes suggested, because a healthy, attentive Victor threatened her freedom to live as she wished without consequences or supervision. The discovery reopened wounds Victor thought were healing, bringing back all the rage and pain he had worked so hard to process. When he shared the discovery with Elena, she held his hands across the coffee shop table where they had met and let him process his anger and grief without trying to minimize them or rush him toward forgiveness. "Does this change anything?" she asked when he finally fell silent. "Does it change how you view your recovery or what you've managed to build since then?" Victor considered the question carefully. "No," he finally answered. "It doesn't change what I've built, but it changes how I view that entire period. Years of my life were stolen by someone who was supposed to care for me. Years when I suffered unnecessarily. And the worst part is that there's nothing I can do about it now. No way to recover that time, or to make Caroline truly pay for what she did. I just have to live with it, with the knowledge that someone I loved was capable of that level of cruelty, and somehow not see it until it was too late." In the 10th month since that decisive morning when Eleanor prevented Victor from throwing food in the trash, they finally admitted to each other and to themselves that what they shared was love. Not the kind of love that appears in movies, sudden and overwhelming, but something that had grown gradually through months of mutual care, honest conversations, and witnessing each other's vulnerabilities. It was a love built on solid foundations of respect and genuine understanding, and because of that, both trusted it in ways they hadn't been able to trust in previous relationships. Marissa was the first to know officially, and her reaction was to hug both of them with tears in her eyes, happy to see her father finally find something real after so much suffering. Victor's transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond his physical health. He was no longer the arrogant businessman who believed knowledge only came from diplomas and that human connections were secondary to financial results. He had learned that wisdom could come from lived experience, that genuinely caring for people was not weakness, but the truest form of strength, that being vulnerable allowed for connections that no mask of invulnerability could ever provide. His firm prospered, not despite his new priorities, but because of them. Loyal and valued employees worked harder and with more dedication than any amount of pressure or threat could ever motivate them. And his health, the condition that had nearly killed him, was completely under control. Not because he had someone constantly caring for him, but because he had learned to care for himself. Elena had also transformed through that journey. She, who had always defined herself through caring for others, finally allowed someone to care for her too. Allowed Victor to see her vulnerabilities and honor them instead of exploiting them. She had accepted one of the job offers she received months earlier, the one from the Integrative Nutrition Clinic, where she now worked helping other people with complex conditions that conventional medicine struggled to treat. It was a job that valued her unique expertise while giving her space to grow and learn in ways that staying as a domestic cook never would have allowed. And for the first time since the loss of her mother, she had something for herself, not just responsibility and duty, but joy and partnership and a future she was actively building instead of simply accepting. On a clear spring morning, 1 year after that transformative day, Victor and Elena were in the kitchen of the house he now rarely occupied alone, preparing breakfast together. The new cook had the day off, and they had decided to do things themselves, recreating that first special meal Elena had prepared and that Victor had almost dumped in the trash. As they worked side by side, laughing at inside jokes and moving with the coordination of people who had learned each other's rhythms, Victor paused and just watched, realizing how different his life was now, how much better in ways he never would have imagined possible a year ago. "Thank you," he said suddenly, making Elena stop and look at him with curiosity, "for not giving up on me when I was too arrogant to see what was right in front of me, for having the courage to grab my arm that morning and stop me from wasting more than just food." Elena smiled, that smile that still made Victor's heart race, and replied with the simplicity that characterized everything she did. "You would have done the same for me," she said, and he realized that yes, the man he had become through that journey of suffering and transformation definitely would, that he had learned that the true value of a life was not measured in business achievements or accumulated wealth, but in the human connections we cultivate and the ways we choose to show up for the people we love. And in that moment, in the same kitchen where months ago he had been so sick he could barely stand, Victor Sterling felt a profound gratitude, not just for the cook who had saved his life with food prepared with knowledge and care, but for the woman who chose to love him through all his imperfections, teaching him that true healing went far beyond the body, reaching places in the soul he didn't even know were broken, until she appeared with her humble wisdom and generous heart, offering not just recipes and meals, but a chance to be reborn as someone better, truer, finally whole.